Corinthians, but you see the pattern, right? About 10 questions, maybe 8, 9 questions. Hopefully we'll be thinking about the things that we need to discuss in that. We've had some challenging chapters, and I think since I'm going to do that, and we've already went over into this quarter, it'll be good for us to review and recap and try to pull all that together before we leave the first letter. So that will be one of my aims too, shortly after we finish, is to try to throw this in and tie it all together and see what all this is about. So we're in chapter 14 tonight because, remember Sunday, we spent a great deal of time trying to define things here. I promised Brother Joe this afternoon, or I guess it's afternoon, morning, we were discussing, I'm going to throw a lot of Greek, but you know, the fact of the matter is there's something to examine here. We're not looking at a lot of Greek, but we're trying to discover what these words mean, you know, as far as the silence and so on and so forth, so that we can apply it well. That's our objective. And so hopefully by this evening you will have at least settled what we're dealing with here. I think this is easier to understand in my estimation, more so than even head coverings, to be quite frank with you, and I think I'm fairly settled in my belief and understanding in that. But nonetheless, well, before we begin, we're going to have a word of prayer. Brother Elliot, would you lead us in prayer before we start class?
Thanking thee, Father, for the church that meets here and the wonderful opportunity that we have this evening to assemble ourselves here as thy children to study another portion of thy word. We're thankful, Father, for the word that you have revealed to us. We can learn more of your will. May I ask thee, Father, to be with the teacher of the hour, and may we be attentive to what is being taught and apply to our lives. We pray now, Father, for those who are sick and unable to be with us, that their health may be restored and they can be back with us soon. We ask thee, Father, to be with us now and forgive us of those things we've done wrong. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. Remember how we looked at the word silent. To keep silent. You'll find it throughout. You'll see that in discussion of the tongue speaker. If you don't have an interpreter, keep silent. If another person has a prophecy, a teaching, then you are to keep silent. Then women, you are to keep silent. So all of this is packaged together. And the word that we're finding throughout this text is the same word. What did we say that you could define, or how could you use silent? Silent in one way would mean, well, that would be one. Let's start with the easiest one. Don't say anything. Don't speak. That's one way of using it, right? Correct. And you're right, Jerry. You brought it up. Don't what? Don't interrupt. Hold the peace is actually the best way to describe it. I like that. That definition helps us. You keep your peace. You know, have you ever had anything you bubble up? I know that Joe and I haven't. You want to say it? We can sometimes get together and we can't get a word in wedgewise. Go ahead. True. He keeps silent. Yeah. Right. I like that because when you look at the one you just described, keep it in his holy temple. It's more than just saying nothing. It's the idea of holding one's peace. Like I said, sometimes we get together, can't hold our peace. We got something to say, we just want to spare. But as he pointed out, that Jesus sometimes didn't say anything. And it wasn't just to be silent for silence sake. He had nothing to say. Either because it would be a waste of words, and Jesus knew how best to keep silent. We have a hard time with that, don't we? It isn't just I got to have the last word, but I'm convinced that I've got to convince you. So I've got to say everything I can say in order to convince you. And though I keep going at it, I stay as thick-headed as I can and keep going at it, when the best thing to do is just say nothing. I've said what needs to be said, and I say nothing more. You had something to say. That's right. That's a good saying. So keep in mind the objective here. Paul's objective isn't speechlessness. If that's his objective, then we're missing a lot of things here. And that goes without the argument of whether or not a woman would say anything in any worship assembly. One of the greatest tragedies is the abuse of this text in this way. Have you ever heard the argument that the period that we're in right now is Bible study, but the period we'll be in Sunday morning is worship? Anybody? I have. As if there was a distinction. Now, I understand, and we need to understand, that God has designated certain activities at certain times, like partaking of the memorial meal and the collection of the saints. And we better designate a time on that day, that Sunday, that first day of the week, to do those things. But we do a terrible disservice to the worship of God when we say, well, this isn't the qualified worship, so then a preacher would run and say, well, this isn't talking about Bible study, so Sister McKenzie can talk. Well, the problem with that argument is you diminish this period that we're in right now, and you made it not as worthy or as elevated in God's sight as, say, maybe a few minutes from now, when we'll have a fellow come up here and lead us in song, lead us in prayer, and give a short lesson or invitation. We have no right to diminish Bible study. Now, if we're going to have any period in which we call the church together, then it needs to be holy before God. Be it a Bible study, or worship, or what we call worship. All of it's worship. Did you realize there's really not a big distinction between the word worship and service? Sometimes, to help us, we will talk about worship in the sense of the activities that we do in an assembly. And then we talk of service in respect to the things we do individually or even collectively outside the assembly. That's generally how we do it. And I have no objections with that, by the way, because that can help us if we're trying to navigate what to do here, what to do there, etc. But really, there is no difference. If you had, let's see, I believe, and I don't have it with me this evening, the New American Standard right there. Leah, you could have looked it up for me. Okay. Getting all my daughters mixed up. Romans 12 and verse 1. I'm going to see if this translation has it. I know that some of the other translations will. No. Well, this one does. Yeah, this kind of deals with it. Okay. Notice what Romans 12 verse 1 says. Now, some of you all probably have the King James. Some of you may have the New King James. But notice what the New American says in Romans 12 verse 1. Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Your spiritual service of worship. Did you see that? Reasonable service. That's what it says in the New King James. That's right, Joe. And there's no objection with any of these, okay? We're not trying to say, oh, this is better than that. But it helps us to understand what I'm saying here. That when we have service and worship, there's very little distinguish. There's very little difference between them, okay? And so let us not get caught into that. So my argument about women and when they can speak, I'm not going to run and say, well, she can speak now because it's Bible study. It's not worship. That's a poor argument. That is not what Paul teaches either. And for that matter, I don't know that the first century church had maybe as we do traditionally, the kind of Bible study in a corporate fashion. I know they had Bible studies together, and they studied daily, in fact. They come together and read and prayed daily. Hebrews chapter 3 tells us that he calls them to come together daily. And we know that from the letter in the Acts that they would do these sorts of things, and they would go to the temple and they would pray daily, and they would probably read daily. Maybe they had Bible studies where they all got together like that, but it was still worship before God. Now, that being said, all we need to answer is whether or not the silence here is an utter silence, or rather simply a holding the peace silence? How do I know that? If I know that it is one or the other, how can I discover that here in our text? Well, that's true. But you know what? You could have women together and they still need to be orderly, right? So they couldn't be, so that really won't help me decide that. But it is true that he says, but he's really giving a blanket to say everything we do in obviously worship to God needs to be done in a fashion that's orderly. And that's true. What would help us discover this? All right. It's just that he waits his turn. Now, that doesn't answer women taking their turn, but what she's saying is true. It answers, at least in part, the ideal of the purpose of the word silent in our text. Does he say, don't say a thing? He says, no, in essence, wait your turn. Take your turn is the ideal. When he says, hold your peace till the other speaks, right? Okay, that's true. But there's something much, much more important, though I'm agreement with that. That's a stair step. Maybe not that far up. Come back down. Okay, what about, let's get over here in our latter part of our text. And he says, verse 34, let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive to the law also says, as the law also says. And if they want to learn, notice, learn something, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in church. How does that answer the question of the holding the peace in respect to the context? Nope, it's not it. Because if that's the argument, we're in trouble. Because we got to go back and say, well, he's not saying to the person that his interpreter don't speak at all. Now, I know when you read that, well, that means just keep your mouth shut and wait and ask later. But it does say that, I agree, but what's the point? Why do we know that it's not utter silence is my argument? All right, you're right. Yeah. Right. Well, she got to wait to get a husband anyway, but yeah, gotcha. All right. Think about this, guys. What is he dealing with? What do you ask questions for? Let's break it all down. Learn something. You want to know something. All right, now you understand what his argument is. See, you now have to address not the utter silence, but address the issue. And the issue at hand is what needs to be said for what purpose or what reason. Here we have, I need to know, or I would like to know, or it would be helpful for me to know what this means. That means, whatever the situation is. All right? That's what he's addressing. That if we deal with that, then we know, as Joe was talking about the singing, that would eliminate the problem with discussion about singing. Are we going to be asking the question about that? We're going to sing songs, and we're supposed to be singing hymns in order to offer praise of worship. She's supposed to offer praise of worship when she comes together as well. But we got to see this in context of what Leah said earlier, too. When she said earlier, when you take that latter part and you put it together with the upper part, and that is, if a person has a prophecy, the person up there speaking, particularly with the tongue, is to do what? Hold his peace. Say nothing. Do not speak. And in this particular context, we're talking about that which would cause that person to lead or to direct what is going on. If it's the person that needs to hold his peace, he needs to subject himself to the other. Correct? All right, let's think about the woman in this context. When she has something she wants to say, she is to hold her peace. You see that? Same word. Now, only thing he adds to this, she don't step down because she's not said to get up. She don't step down in order to allow the other person to speak. She doesn't. She holds her peace and waits for the answer later, privately, as it says in the context, from her husband. Okay? You see the point? Now, we think, well, ask questions. So that means that if Leah, as she's already done, or Sister Mackenzie, or any other lady in this class, says anything or asks any question, then she is in violation of this text, right? Is that what we're saying? Now, what's the context? Again, what's the problem? This is a worship in which spiritual gifts are used. Because as we already seen in chapter 13, they didn't have everything perfect yet, right? So what do? Well, we're not winging everything, but there is prophecy because it's needed for teaching. There are tongue speaking, if there is, in order to benefit an unbeliever who has come in among us, as we've already seen. All of these things are occurring. So we know that what we're dealing with is a special situation, an issue in which she wouldn't be able, again, without usurping authority, to discover anything, to do anything, without stepping over her boundary. That's the case. Now, how does it apply to us? So the preacher, you might say, well, preacher, okay, maybe I get that. Maybe that's exactly what it says. But then what does that mean for us? Well, it means this. The same thing would be true. That if she is, for instance, hearing one who is speaking and she doesn't have a full grasp of everything that's being said, and that there will be a chance that she would be in conflict with the person leading and therefore lead and take over, then she too would have to hold her peace. You see, we have common language being used here, and we assume a whole lot of things that are not there. Though he does talk about asking, remember, first we have a situation in which everything's been done, or at least a lot of things, has been done in an inspirational way. And furthermore, that makes it more complicated and difficult. We don't have the same obstacles necessarily. But it is possible for a woman to have a hard time in some area, and which if she were to speak out, she would go back to what Brother David was saying earlier, his first point about this. She could cause disorder. She certainly would be in a situation in which she could cause, again, this interruption that would also cause the usurpation, because it goes back to what even Brother Henderson said about 1 Corinthians chapter 11 in this regard. That's all it means. That if we get in there, and it's not that a teacher can't ask, like I would ask Sister Mackenzie, but let's say that she started interjecting and started leading, and I've seen that sometimes as well. Because I've seen women think, well, that's acceptable. It goes back to the original problem. Well, this ain't worship. She can do what? No, she can't. This is worship. Can't do this any more than she can in the other assembly that we'll have. So that won't work. But the point is very plain. If say, Sister Mackenzie, if you don't mind me picking on you, if she were to just keep on interjecting and causing disruption in the process of our discussion, then she would be considered disorderly and she would be violating this holding the peace. That's the point. And neither any of us, none of us, that is, should be disorderly, because that's what we learn when we get to the end, anyhow. Or any questions about that?
Two men in the class got into a row with a bunch of screaming and hollering at one another. And I stayed till the end of the service, but I never did go back to the congregation again. I just went to one close by, another work. But that thing, I don't know how I should have. I probably done the best thing by it because I was just a visitor. But they disrupted the whole service, two old knuckleheads, in a class, in a Bible study.
Yeah. That can happen. And that's not right either, any more than it would be with women. So what we find in the Word, when we look at the latter part as far as her being in subjection, it's and this goes into the grammar, and I don't mean to make this, more complicated, but it's understood in the original Greek that this is what they call the middle voice. It's the ideal of, if it's not an assertive, the middle voice shows that she's showing voluntary. Every time the middle voice is used, she's voluntarily subjecting herself to, is the ideal. And that would be true of all of us. We voluntarily subject ourselves to one another. Paul says that to the Romans. You put yourself into subjection to one another is the ideal. Same thing would be true here. And so you obey. And when we already talked about that word originally, it comes from the military. The command, the chain of command is what it is. It's a military word. It was used all over Greek in that respect. All right? So asking her husband at home, it was improper. If there's a situation where it's improper for her to interject that will cause a disruption, a change of command. You see the word? Changes command. So now the person that's leading is not longer leading, but the other person is. And if the other person is the woman that is leading, we've already got the problem. And that's what Paul was dealing with. Now we can speculate as to what they were doing. Some have suggested, well, they had women getting up there and speaking in tongues before the assembly. It doesn't say that. But what we do know is that in the worship, wherever they were at whatever time they were at, worshiping, and I believe they were, that there was this disruption. And there were several problems. People thought it was so important that they get what they want said that they interjected or stopped others from saying what needed to be said, as we've stated earlier. The Holy Spirit would have guided this person that knows prophecy. Say it's Joe, if we were having spiritual gifts. I'm up here speaking in tongue. Even if I have a translator, we know from 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 1, prophecy is more important than what he has to say is the teaching of the Word of God. I need to step down. He needs to say what he needs to say. You see how the orderly works? And that if I did have a word in another tongue, assuming it would benefit anyone, I better have a translator or I better know what I'm saying. Otherwise, it benefits no one. Right? And by the same conclusion, even regardless of what the women were doing, they're not to interject and try to disrupt or to cause a chain of command change by usurping authority. That's what Paul is saying. And he's addressing an issue that is obviously a problem there, that could be a problem is not only there that divides the church and destroys what God intended it for, but encourage others to do the same thing, because these people would travel, and no doubt they would be close enough to the other churches of Macedonia, a whole lot of issues could happen, or close to the church of Macedonia, churches of Macedonia. All right, any questions about that? one other thing. If, and I know sisters that do, and husbands and as well as the wives, if they feel very strongly that their women or the women will not speak in Bible study, so be it. Let it be. All right? There's no one violating it. If anything, guess what? Is there any danger of not holding the peace then? There ain't none by that point. But I want to make sure that we're clear. Do not make any arbitrary distinction between the time we're spending here and the time we'll spend in a few moments. Or for that matter, Sunday morning until, you see? Again, there are distinctions. Do not get me wrong in the sense that we are commanded to partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, and we're commanded to give on the first day of the week. But you know what? If we came together for a memorial collection service, we've done nothing wrong on Sunday. If we choose other periods to study, to sing, we had a singing service. Do you know what this evening and the midweek was originally called and where that came about? You ever heard the term prayer meeting? You realize prayer meeting was originally when people could begin to meet other than the Lord's Day. Traveling was difficult. Churches were closer to where you lived. You may have walked there. Some churches would decide we can do this at certain seasons, and we will have a prayer meeting, or we'll have a special meeting. They literally would come together for what? Prayer. Now, I'm not saying they wouldn't read Scripture or anything like that, but they really did come together for prayer. And where that arrived from is way back, even before we were this country, and all way back. Even as far back into the second and third century, this is very common. They would get together for special prayer meetings, not necessarily on a Wednesday night, but they would get together for prayer meetings. Well, Paul says that they would meet daily. The Hebrew writer says that it says that in Acts, and so why should that surprise us? They would go to the temple and do that. Eventually, the churches, they would get together, and they would have meetings for prayer. So this is my plug. Be here on Tuesday night next for prayer. We're going to study that. No. But, well, yes, but nonetheless, you see the point. Be careful. And so make sure that you are doing things, we are doing things in order to serve God to the best of our ability according to His plan. And we don't do anything out of order. Since we have Bible study, it is a good time, as I understand it, in which if I choose to ask a lady who is willing to speak a question, that's acceptable. And if I do so, are they doing anything wrong? Are they not being in subjection? Not unless they step over all of that and take over a class. Be careful of that, right? Right. Now, of course, the external argument that you brought up earlier, we know, and all that would be is just discuss. It is the answer of the negative, an answer in the negative issue. That is, this word cannot mean utter silence in the fact that there would be no word spoken. If that were the case, understanding worship to God is sacred before Him, whether it's this period or any other period, then yes, it would be demanded. She would be prohibited from singing. Now, he's very specific about asking the husband. Notice that. Why do you suppose Paul didn't say daughter? Some would say, well, it said husband. If you don't have a husband, then I don't have to listen to this. And others would say, well, until I get married, I don't have to worry about this. And if I'm a widow, by the way, I don't have to worry about this. How would you answer that? We'll raise these potential objections. What is the text? Why is it important that Paul addresses this issue? That's true, but that don't really help us here per se. Because, remember, as I said before, you're right if you want to make a generic application, but he's very specific about the words here. Someone would have to say, and I think we have to stretch, and that's just why I'm saying I'd be careful, because while you're saying, everything you're saying, David, is exactly true as far as headship, leadership, etc. And Paul's already addressed that technically in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3. And I agree with you. But we got to be very careful, because then we get to misapplying what is being said. He says specifically husbands. There's no interchange here. He's not saying husband can mean father. He's not saying that. It literally means one who is married to. So he demands a specific application in context. While your statement of truth is true, it's not explained here. Why he says this, and it's not that complicated, as he already gives us a hint of where the problem lies. That apparently, within the context of this silence issue, that it was contained within the married women. It wasn't a bunch of single women. I don't know what single women would have been like and whether we would have. I'm sure they could have had widows. They could have had daughters, which, as you pointed out, would have been under the authority of the father. But all Paul is addressing is a specific, he gives us good application that we can make today all over the board, but he makes it clear where the problem lies, and that's where we know it lies, just as it does in general with women in chapter 11, or as the whole, as we learn in chapter 11 as well when it comes to memorial meal, without being specific. Here he's just specific. We're learning who seems to be the issue. That's all he's saying. Husbands, he says, are women, ladies in particular, are husbands. Women in this particular case, by the way, and I don't know if you guys know this, but in the Greek, the word for women is actually also translated or used in the same word for wife. In other words, it's not a separate word. It's opposed to or opposite to the word virgin, which would be daughter, which we sometimes translate daughter. In other words, one who was under the authority but was not married to would be considered virgin, daughter, etc. Whereas the word for women, though we can find in context when it deals with women that are less than chaste in their character, because he does describe those kinds of issues, that the woman is oftentimes used at where we would find the word wife. And maybe somebody would have a modern translation. I don't have one handy with me. I have one on the back that might actually translate that word wife. And I know there is. I can't. Maybe the Christian Standard. Oh, the New American might use that. Let me find that real quick. I should have taken the time to figure out which ones. But they will translate that wife for good reason, because that's exactly what he's dealing with. Because you can't have a husband without a wife. It stands to reason. You can have a woman, if you use it generically like we do, without a husband. You can have a man without a wife. All right? But you can't have a husband without a wife. So, what does he say? Let's see. Verse 34. No, he uses the New American uses the word women as well. I don't know. Maybe Christian Standard. There may be some others that would use the word wife. It's implied wife anyway because he says husband here. All right. Anything else that somebody wants to add to that? Maybe you disagree with some things I've said, and that's fine. Let's talk about it. Three things. Three things we have to learn from chapter 14. Sister McKenzie, what would be one of those things, if you don't mind answering?
Want me to read all three of them?
You can, yeah. Read your three. Yes, please.
Well, for me, proper order for tongues to be edifying.
Okay.
All things strengthening and encouraging. And orderliness of administration of the gifts.
Very good. I like those. Those are good. Not necessarily what I wrote down, but you see what my point is. That we can discover some things when we read each other's three, and we should have done more of that throughout this class, but that is very good. So when you do an overview, what she's got now is an outline of this chapter. And so if maybe you're talking, maybe you have a friend or a neighbor, and there's some of these discussions come up. Of course they would among religious people or people, maybe in general, because this is a controversial chapter, isn't it? And so you need to think about that, and so you have an overview of what it would be like, so that when you begin to talk about the various aspects, you have a reference point. Because I know this for fact. If you're not certain about what's being said specifically, it's going to be hard to defend anything that needs to be said. It's going to be hard to defend the truth because it's easy to get into the muddy waters because then you're confused. I'm not saying it won't be challenging anyway. That's not the issue. But I do know this. It'll be much simpler once you have some things settled about what's being said. That way, first of all, I know where to go if something's said. And then second of all, let's first look at what is being said. Let's just kind of consider these things, right? Very good. Clay, you don't have any, do you? You just got the sheet tonight, didn't you? Go ahead. Yeah, you got him?
The women's right to speak, I guess.
Okay.
If you interpret it that way.
Well, either
And
way,
also,
right to speak is still considered, right? Yeah, go ahead.
well, and also how the assemblies are to be orderly
Yeah. And that's very
in
important, isn't
every
it?
fashion.
Very good. Okay. Let me give you what I have, and then, well, let me ask somebody else before we do. Sister Jordan, do you have anything?
Different?
Yeah.
I had that tongue speaking had a purpose, signs of the unbelievers, and it must be interpreted to be done appropriately and must be done in order.
Right.
And that God commands order in the assembly, one at a time, regardless of role. And that, the women and we already talked about women's sound.
Great. Great. There you go. So you got something that you can work with in your study or in discussions with another person. If you got that framed in your mind, then you have an idea where you work. And when you do these things, and that's one of the things I want to do in a review, is I want to put these 3 to 4 lessons for each chapter, repeat those and kind of examine those, because those will be our benchmark for all the things we'll discover in the letter, so that I know where to go when I'm dealing with a specific issue or concern that this might be helpful, you see. Now, when you see the discussion of the tongue speaking that you all have mentioned, think of this. When he talks about the gift, the spiritual gift, now you might say for our sake, talents or abilities, everything has to be for edification, right? It's really what we discover. That if I don't build up, now I don't mean to say that we build up well, first of all, this word is used primarily in biblical context, obviously for spiritual, although it is a word that can be used outside of spiritual things. But keep that in mind. Your only aim, ultimately, is to do what you can do to build up. Anything you do that tears down, you need to stop. And that would include, of course, speaking out of turn, tongue speaking without translators, women preachers, whatever the case may be. If it ain't building up, then it's tearing down. So edification's your aim. Secondly, pursue worship, and this is really connected to the previous. Pursue worship to understand. Notice in the middle of it we said, sing with the understanding, pray with the understanding, right? He's saying using the mind's capacity to understand application. That's the point. Because I could say a lot of things that are true, but what if you don't understand them? What have I done? I've not benefited you. I might understand some things, but we're not here just to edify ourselves. We're here to edify one another. In fact, that's what Hebrews 10 verse 24 says. We come together, as 25 says, in order, in verse 24, to stir up one another to love and good works. So you have to understand, I have to understand, we pursue worship with the purpose of understanding. In order to be more pleasing to God, to cause us, to draw us into His service. In other words, if we're talking about worship in the sense of what we're doing this evening, or what we do on the Lord's Day, that my aim and your aim should be to do what is necessary to make us better servants when we leave this building. So when I go out there, whomever I come in contact with, whatever relationships I have, whatever work I have, whatever studies I have, whatever practice, whatever I do, that I'm ready to be of service to the Lord. That's what it's all about. I pursue worship to understand how I can be more pleasing to God in my daily service before Him. Therefore, I can draw closer to Him. And the third, respect God's institutions. Respect your role in the kingdom. And if you think about it, we could talk all night and try to discover what exactly we're dealing with in regards to women and the silence and all that, but what is the necessary conclusion, especially even as Brother Henderson brought that up several weeks ago, as he talks about from chapter 11. The main thing, respect your place in the kingdom. Look for your work, but make sure that you're not usurping any one or other work in order to make the kingdom as strong as it can be here on this earth. Because the kingdom is as strong as it needs to be, all as far as eternal perspective. But is this local congregation everything that it can be? So respect God's instruction on your role in the kingdom. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3 helps us with that. And also what David says from Ephesians 6:4 would be worthy as well. Although that's outside this letter, but definitely Paul's letter. All right, anything else before we close? Chapter 15, Sunday. Thank you.